Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to see you all here today. If you have your Bible, if you would turn to 2 Timothy chapter 4, we'll be in verses 9 through 22 this morning. So again, that is 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 9 through 22. These verses make up the last passage in the book of 2 Timothy. And brings our sermon series through 2 Timothy to a close. And I have personally just loved walking through this book, reading and studying Paul's letter to Timothy, and just learning what God would teach us through what Paul wrote. And if you're anything like me, sometimes Paul can seem like this larger-than-life figure in the Bible. Right? He's like a super Christian or something, right? It seems that at every turn in his story, God is just with him, and he is faithful, and he just, through the odds, continues to hold fast to the faith, right? He writes letters to people, and they end up in Scripture, right? Like, none of my letters ended up in the Bible. But his do, right? They make up about half the New Testament. He feels like he's almost like a different type of person in a league of his own. But here, at the end of his final letter, if we were tempted to believe in this mythologized version of Paul, we are brought back to reality. We come face to face with Paul, not as some Christian Lone Ranger or Christian Superman, but as a man at the end of his life, as human as you or I. We get to see a side of Paul that pierces through our fantastical version of him and shows us who he truly was, right? He did many great things for the gospel of Jesus Christ. And he lived a life dedicated to the Lord, but he did not do it alone. He relied heavily on his God, and he was surrounded by community, by fellow Christians. And here at the very end, in his final letter to Timothy, he reminds him of the importance of living in community. So if you would, read with me, starting in verse 9, this passage. Do your best to come to me soon, for Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry. Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. When you come, bring the cloak I left with Carpus at Troas, also the books, and above all the parchments. Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Beware of him yourself, for he strongly opposed our message. At my first defense, no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. May it not be charged against them, but the Lord stood by me and strengthened me, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil deed and bring me safely into his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Greet Prisca and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus remained at Corinth, and I left Trophimus, who was ill at Miletus. Do your best to come before winter. Eubulus sends greetings to you, as do Pudens and Linus and Claudia and all the brothers. The Lord be with your spirit. Grace be with you. When Paul wrote this book, he was close to his death, right? He tells Timothy this just a few verses earlier, right? Verse 6, he says, "The time of my departure has come." Right, in fact, this is the last letter that we have from Paul, right? Which makes this passage, these words, the last recorded words of Paul. Now, you would kind of expect someone like Paul, his last words to be these like amazing, awe-inspiring, like quote wall-worthy words, right? You'd almost kind of expect how he ended our last week's passage to be his final words, right? I'm just going to read it again for us, starting in verse 6. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. That's how I want my last words to sound. Right? I want to be able to get to the end of my life and say, I lived in such a way that my life is a complete and worthy offering to God. Right? I want to be able to look back and say, I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I was faithful. Right? And now I'm going to see Jesus, right, who loves me and who I loved, and he's going to give me a crown for the way I lived. Right, that's how I want my last words to sound, right? This is the type of life we should want as Christians, right? Paul ends that passage by saying, but not only to me, but to all who have loved his appearing. Right, we want to get to the end and hear the well done, my good and faithful servant. But often, and too often I fear, we take our faith, we take our Christianity, and we treat it just like so many of the other things that we want in life. If I want a promotion, well, I devote myself to my work, right? Working to be better than everyone else, right? Working to be recognized for my accomplishments until I get that promotion. Right? If I want to get better grades in class, or have the best grades in class, right? I devote myself to my schoolwork. Right? Trying to outcompete all of my classmates, or at least outcompete my sibling, As long as I'm better than my sister, we're good. Right? But this is how we do life. If I want something, I work for it, I devote myself to it until I get it. And that's not always bad, right? Paul uses language like that elsewhere in the scriptures to describe our faith. But what must never be true of our faith, right, what must never be true of our faith, which is so often the case in the rest of our lives, is that our faith must never become a solo event. Paul knows that the reason he has been able to fight the good fight, to run the race, to keep the faith, is because God gave him Christian community. God gave him the church to fight the fight together, to run the race as a team, and to remain faithful with each other. That's why verses 6 through 8 are not how Paul ends this letter to Timothy. Those are not his last words. He continues in our passage today. Look at verse 9 again. Do your best to come to me soon. This journey of life, this Christian pilgrimage that we are all on, is not something we are meant to do alone. God did not save us into isolation. Right? God did not save us into isolation. We need each other if we want to say along with Paul, I have fought the good fight. You, Christian, you need others, and others need you. For this whole letter, Paul has been encouraging and teaching Timothy on how to live a faithful and fruitful life. Right? And now, though, he turns the camera around. He flips the script. Right? Paul is asking for Timothy to come to him. And why? Well, because Paul knows that now he needs encouragement himself. He needs help to continue to be faithful and fruitful in his own life. And we have spent these past few weeks learning from this book how to live faithfully and fruitfully ourselves. But if our whole world, our whole Christian experience begins and ends with us, we have learned this in vain. If we just take what we have learned and try to do it on our own, we are going to be sorely disappointed. And this is a truth that Paul has experienced in his own life, right? When Saul became Paul, he needed Ananias to come and heal him and point him in the right direction. When he was just becoming a Christian, he needed Peter, Cephas, to take him aside for a few weeks and teach him the things of the Lord, right? When he was beginning his missionary journeys, he never went alone. He took a team with him. Almost all of his letters, right, he writes about how encouraged he is to hear of the faithfulness of the church that he is writing to. In this letter, we've already heard of how Onesiphorus came to him in Rome and encouraged him when he needed it. And this letter itself is a testimony to the relationship between Paul and Timothy, right? Their close friendship and how Paul relies on Timothy in their friendship. And here we learn that he just wants to see Timothy, right? This man that he called his son one last time before he died. Paul is just like you or I. Yes, he was an apostle, And yes, he did do great things for the kingdom of God, but he did not do any of them alone. He was helped, supported, relied upon, all these things by other believers. Pathway, we need community. And I think all of us would agree with that statement. Right? I would hope that all of us would agree with the statement that we need community. Right? We nod along with Paul as he asked for Timothy to come visit him, to refresh him, to help him in his ministry. But I wonder if we actually looked at how we live our lives, do we actually live this out? Or do we do what James says, right, and look at ourselves in the mirror and as soon as we walk away, forget what we looked like? I know I often do, right? I love the idea of Christian community. You know, if you talk to any of the young adult leaders in here after the service, you'll know that I get all of them to read a book called Life Together if they agree to come onto the leadership team, which is a book that is all about Christian community. And even today, during the second service, we're meeting together to discuss that book. I love the idea that because of our shared salvation in Christ, we can bear each other's burdens, right? We can encourage one another. We can be known by each other. We can point one another back to Jesus, right? And we can do life together. I love it until I don't. I love that I'm a part of a church that helps people pack up their stuff to move when they're moving houses, right? I know so many of you in here have been blessed by that. I love it until I have to wake up on a Saturday morning to go help somebody move, right? I love that I'm a part of a church that brings people meals, that visits each other in the hospital. I love it until I have to sign up to cook or I have to give up some of my time to go to the hospital, right? And maybe those are parts of community that come easy to you. Right? Maybe you just love helping people move, or you're a great cook, or you just love giving of your time to go to the hospital, right? But if someone asks for your help with the evangelism night, or someone asks if you pray for the group, or if you're asked to give some of your money to help someone go on a missions trip, suddenly it becomes harder, right? Or maybe, and this is the big one, I think, people want to actually know you. Right? Beyond just the surface pleasantries of the mask that we put on for the world, people want to actually know your weaknesses and share theirs with yours too. Right? That's what bearing each other's burdens is all about. Why do we find this so hard? Right? Why do we love the idea of Christian community, but so often find ourselves unwilling to commit to it? Well, if we look back at our passage this morning, we'll see that Paul answers that question in two ways in what he writes to Timothy. He first says that we need community even though it can hurt us. Look with me again at verses 10 and 11. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia, Luke alone is with me. To truly be in community is always risky. Why? Well, because to truly love and to be truly loved, you have to be truly known. The very thing that we need community for is the same thing that can cause us so much hurt. The sharing of our true selves, of our deepest traits and character defects, is what allows us to love and be loved by others. But it is also what opens us up to being hurt. The more people know us, the more we are hurt if they let us down or leave us. And this is true in every community we could ever join, but it feels especially hurtful when it happens in the church, doesn't it? And this is what Paul is describing in this passage. Right? Demas was a close ministry partner and probably a good friend of Paul's, someone who Paul describes as one of his fellow workers to Philemon, and who gets a special mention at the end of the book of Colossians, right? Demas was on Paul's ministry team, someone who was very close to Paul, working side by side with him, and yet we learn because things got tough, because he loved the world, he's deserted Paul when Paul needed him most. You can almost hear the pain with which Paul is describing the situation he's in. He's been imprisoned for being faithful to the gospel. And now, as he's facing the end, he knows his death is coming. He's been deserted by a close friend. 2 other people have left, although it sounds like on better terms, but he's alone, right? Luke alone is with him. He's feeling that in his moment of deepest need, everyone has left him. So why is Paul so hurt? Well, I think we understand why. One of our greatest fears is that we'll be abandoned. We fear being truly alone, of being rejected. Specifically, we fear revealing ourselves to someone else, to truly letting them in, and then facing rejection. We fear someone knowing us, all of us, not just the mask that we show them, and then still saying no. And this is why we don't let people in so much of the time. This is why we put on our masks. We fear being vulnerable with others. If they reject my mask, I can always take it off. I can always put on another one. But here's the thing. Yes, being vulnerable can expose us to hurt. But it's also what leads to intimacy, to love. In fact, the very reason we fear being vulnerable is because we know this. The more intimate we are with others, the more potential there is for pain from those whom we love. And that's why it hurts so much. And this feels negative, but it's really not. And Paul knows this too. He understands the pain of being deserted by someone who knew him intimately. But Paul also understands that it is still worth it to continue to be intimate with others. He knows that it is only through intimacy that we can truly love one another. And that is the way that Jesus said that we would be recognized by the world, is it not? That we would be known by the way in which we love one another. That is why he's asking Timothy to come to him. How is Paul able to do that, though? Right? When we are so hurt by those we love, especially when those people leave or abandon us, it can be so hard to learn to love again. Right? Whenever there is an opportunity to grow in intimacy with a new person, we're reminded of the hurt caused by the last time we tried that. Maybe it was a close friend who left you in your time of need, like what happened to Paul here. Maybe it was a sibling who knew something about you and used it against you for their gain. Maybe it was a spouse that left you. Maybe you confessed a deep sin to a fellow Christian. And instead of being met with the grace and mercy of Jesus, you're met with judgment. After suffering hurt like that from people so close, how can we risk real community again? Well, we can do it by looking to the one who has saved us and actually called us into community. Jesus gave us a command to love each other, to be in community with other believers. But remember, the same night he gave us that command, he was himself betrayed. Right? You see, Jesus knows what it is to look at someone in the eyes that you've done life with, that you've lived with, that you've served with, right? And as you offer that person the bread of friendship, to have rejection thrown back into your face. Right? Judas was one of the inner circle. He was loved by Jesus, and yet it was Judas who betrayed him over to be crucified. And if that wasn't enough, on that night in that garden, all of his friends desert him when he needed them most. Peter, right, the rock on which the church was going to be built, denied him not once, not twice, but 3 times. Jesus knows what it is like to be utterly alone when you need your loved ones most. But don't forget, we aren't in the clear here either, right? Why was Jesus betrayed? Well, it was for our sake. All of us, every person in this room, has turned their back on God before. We have all abandoned him to seek after our own desires. And we have, similarly to Demas, turned our back on our friend and our God because we were in love with this present world. And yet, Jesus still died for us. He did not abandon us in return. He knows our deepest secrets, our deepest vulnerabilities, and yet still loves us. He has seen us as we truly are and has never turned his back on us. So how can we risk the pain of real community again? Well, by trusting in the one who has commanded us to love each other. He knows what it is like to be betrayed, yet he still came after us to show us love. He knows our deepest vulnerabilities and still looks at us and shows love. We can risk community again because we know there is one who understands our pain and who knows us fully and yet will never turn his back on us. And now we get to show that love to other believers. Right? We get to embrace each other and just like Jesus did for us, love each other, vulnerabilities and all. In fact, this is how James tells us that we find healing from our sin and our character defects, right? In the act of confession, which is one of the deepest acts of true intimacy and love. If you have been burned by the church before, if you've been hurt by Christians, those who are supposed to love you, then I want you to hear from me this morning that I'm sorry. That's not how it's supposed to be. That's a symptom of the fallenness of our world. But if you've been using that as an excuse to hold the world or the church at a distance, at arm's length, to deny both yourself and others true intimacy in the Lord, then I want you to hear this morning. Christian community is needed. Yes, it exposes our vulnerabilities, but that is what love does. We need you. The church needs you, and you need us. Not because any of us are perfect, but because we all trust in the one who is. And Paul gives us another reason, though, for why we need community, right? We need community to make us effective for ministry. Look at how Paul continues in verse 11. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry. Tychicus, I have sent to Ephesus. When you come, bring the cloak I left with Carpus at Troas, also the books, and above all the parchments. Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Beware of him yourself, for he strongly opposed our message. Paul knows that ministry is not a solo event. Even after he has been left almost completely alone by his fellow workers, he knows that if he wants to continue to effectively and faithfully fulfill his ministry, he's going to need help. Right? Again, though, I think we would agree with this. We hear that we need others to do ministry well, and we nod along, but we arrive back at that first question, right? If we actually look at our lives, are we living this out? See, we have a temptation to believe that we can be ministry effective all on our own, right? That we don't need the church or other believers to rightly live out our Christian lives. Another way of putting it might be to say that we believe that we can advance the kingdom of God without any help from that kingdom, right? Maybe a way of thinking about this is, have you ever been put in a group project, maybe at school or at work, and when you saw who else was in that group project with you, you just wished you could do it by yourself? You know, you saw who you had to work with, and you just thought, oh, I know it's going to be more work, but I'd much rather just go on my own. Or this is how we sometimes look at church, right? Either because of an experience we had with the church or with a Christian, or just because of the stage of life we're in, we see the church, we see Christian community as a burden that doesn't benefit us at all. And that isn't true. I want to make something clear here as well. All of us are called to some form of ministry, right? This teaching isn't just for people that we often label as full-time ministers, right? Like Paul or Pastor Josh, right? We are all called to serve Jesus with our lives. Paul says elsewhere that our lives are not our own, that they've been bought at a price, and so we are to serve God with our bodies. And our service to God, our ministry, is always most effective when it is done in community. If we look at what Paul writes to Timothy in these verses, I think that we can find three applications to our own lives about on how that is true. And the first one is just that ministry becomes easier in community. Right? Paul asks for Timothy to bring Mark with him when he comes, because apparently Mark is useful to him for ministry. Paul knows that ministry becomes easier with other people. Right? We all have different gifts, different abilities that complement each other when we work together for the kingdom. And this is a consistent teaching throughout the Bible, right? Think of Jesus sending out the 72, right? He doesn't send them alone, he sends them in pairs. In the New Testament, it is rare to find anyone doing the work of God alone. They're almost always doing it with others, right? But stepping out in boldness, stepping out in our faith is risky, and we all know that. right? It can be uncomfortable. I think of this every time I'm presented with an opportunity to share the gospel, right? Whether it be at Panera or at the park or in Panama, right? I'm living my life and something happens. And I get that little feeling, that little voice in my head that says, this is it. This is the opportunity that you've been asking for to share your hope in Jesus. But almost as quickly as that voice appears, another one shows up, right? And it says, yeah, but that will be really uncomfortable, won't it? Might as well not. And unfortunately, that second voice so often wins out. But when I'm with other people, when we even set out with the explicit goal of evangelizing, it becomes so much easier. I know I have someone at my back. I know there's others supporting me. Many of you know my parents, who attended here at Pathway for many years, and they recently moved to Vancouver, Canada. And if any of you have ever been to Vancouver before, you know that it is a very dark place. You can almost feel tangibly the opposition to the gospel in the air. And so they knew when they got there that one of the first things that they needed to do was to find a new church to be a part of. And they did. They found a little Baptist church, and they've been attending, but they were finding it hard to get involved, to actually participate in the community. And one Sunday they were there, and the church announced that they were going to be doing kind of an evangelism night that week. They were going to be bringing invitations to the church service around the community and offering to pray for people. And my dad said he was nervous, but they decided to go. And, it could be really scary. He said, especially in Vancouver, more so than other places, it can be scary to talk to people about Jesus. But they showed up, and I remember I got a call from my dad that night, and he just said how amazing of an experience it was. They went out with a group of 4 other people and just shared the gospel with people and handed out invitations and prayed for one another. And he said the side product of that is that he got to really know those other 4 people in his group, and he's still really good friends with them to this day. Doing ministry with others makes it easier. Our different personalities and different gifts complement each other, and we find out that our kingdom impact is strengthened. We cannot believe the lie that we will be more effective on our own. The second application is that ministry outlives us when we do it in community. Throughout this passage, right, Paul keeps telling Timothy where people are and what they're doing. Right, he's informed Timothy about Demas, about Crescens and Titus. Here in verse 12, Paul tells Timothy that he sent Tychicus to Ephesus. Right, and he ends the letter by informing Timothy where a bunch of other people are as well. Why is Paul doing this? Do you think he's just letting Timothy know where the boys are at? Just letting him know where the people are? No, Paul knows that he's going to die soon. He knows that his time is short, but he trusts that God is going to continue his work. Right? The work of God does not depend on any one person. Right? The work of God does not depend on any one person. Paul is letting Timothy know where everyone is because he's preparing for the time when Timothy will have to continue his ministry. Even in his request for his books and parchments and his cloak, Paul is preparing for the time where he won't be able to continue any longer. We see Paul writing and studying, wanting to do that even more, as he's always done through his whole Christian life. Why? But to encourage other believers on in their faith. Right? He knows that it's not all about him. Paul knows that by himself, he can make an impact for the gospel with his life. But with others, he can make an impact for the gospel that far surpasses his own life. I think about Walt Disney, right? On his own, a great man, right? He pioneered the animation industry, right? He wrote some of the most famous and influential children's movies of our time. And I just learned this. As a film producer, he still holds, to this day, the record for most Academy Awards, both earned and nominated by an individual. But when we think of Disney, we rarely think of Walt, right? We think of the company that he started. We think of all the people that work there now, all the stuff that they've made ever since. Why? Well, because he got others involved. He wanted what he started to go on after he died. And we can serve God in a similar way, right? We can serve God faithfully with the life that he has given us. We can accomplish great things for Christ and his kingdom, but if we do it alone, if we never invest in others and bring people in, it will just end with us. Right? When we do ministry with others, we serve God with his people, and our work will far outlive our own lives. So ministry becomes easier in community. It outlives us in community. And third, we are better equipped to deal with ministry opponents in community. Right? If we live faithful lives, we will face opposition. This is just a promise in the Bible, right? Our message of hope confronts those who are living for the world. In Paul's case, it was Alexander the coppersmith. Right? We don't really get a reason for why Alexander opposed the gospel message, but that he just caused Paul great harm, right? Similarly, we hear from missionaries who go out to the field that they face opposition for sharing the gospel. We have missionaries in our own church who have gone to places where sharing the gospel could be a life or death thing, right? They know better than most how important community is, right? I think of the famous missionary Jim Elliot. Right, he and 4 others traveled to Ecuador to share the gospel with a people group deep in the rainforest there who had never heard it. They were hostile to outsiders. They had attacked and killed people who had come on their land before. But these 5 men wanted to share the gospel, even at the cost of their own lives. So they spent years trying to contact this group and share the good news with them. And for years, they were unsuccessful. But they started to see some change, some progress. And so one day they went. They thought, this is going to be it. This is the day we get to share the good news. But on that fateful day, on January 8th, 1956, they were martyred. They were killed for trying to share the good news. But because they were doing this not just on their own, the story does not end there. Right? Elizabeth, Jim Elliot's wife, continued the mission, and she went and forgave the people who killed her husband and was able to eventually share the gospel with them. This is why Paul tells Timothy about Alexander. In order to face opposition well, we need community. And maybe for you, the danger doesn't seem that great. It's not a life or death issue. I think for most of us, it's not. But maybe our reputation is at stake among our friend group. Maybe our work has told us that there will be repercussions if we bring faith into the workplace. Right? Maybe it's just as simple as we've made the right choice and now the devil is attacking us spiritually. Right? If we live faithfully, we will face opposition. But by being in community, we will face it together and we will face it well. Being in community won't always make the opposition any less tough, but it will make it easier to stand strong. So we need community, even though it can hurt us. And we need each other if we want to be effective for ministry. But what about those times when we don't have community? What are we to do when we are abandoned, when we are alone, in those moments when we aren't shoulder to shoulder with other believers, when we don't have fellow Christians to help us? What are we to do? Well, Paul has requested Timothy to join him. He's asked for Mark to come, all because he's in that very situation, right? He knows he needs help, but in the moment he has none. How does he respond? Well, he remembers this simple truth. When we don't have community, God is still with us. Right? When we don't have community, God is still with us. Look at what Paul says in verses 16 through 18. At my first defense, no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. May it not be charged against them. But the Lord stood by me and strengthened me, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed, and all the Gentiles might hear it. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil deed and bring me safely into his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Paul has been in this situation before. He's been completely abandoned in his moment of greatest need. He's been left with no one to stand with him. But that is when God made his presence most known. God is always with us, especially when we're in community, right? Jesus tells us where 2 or more are gathered, there I am with them. But when we are alone and need the people of God most, Jesus does not leave us. He didn't leave Paul. Paul remembers that when he was forced to defend himself in trial because everyone abandoned him, Jesus stood by him and strengthened him. Jesus rescued him. And so Paul is confident that if Jesus rescued him then he will surely rescue him now. We see every aspect of what Paul has been imparting to Timothy in this passage at play here, right? Paul was hurt by his friends abandoning him, and yet he shows forgiveness. Let it not be held against them. He knows how much he's been forgiven by Jesus, and so he forgives. He knows that a ministry is not a solo event, so when he is able to, on his own, proclaim the gospel message so that all the Gentiles might hear it, he counts it as a divine working of God. And now, as he reflects upon how Jesus delivered him before, he trusts that he will do it again. But he's under no delusion. He knows that his life here on earth is ending. He's told Timothy so. He is confident that, should his life be taken, if he is killed, he will go to be with Jesus in his heavenly kingdom. His every evil deed has been nailed up to the cross, and he is ready to be with Jesus forever in his glory. This is the gospel. If you are a Christian here this morning, this is for you. Remember how Jesus saved you. Remember what he has brought you through. Remember the times he has strengthened you and rescued you. Remember your salvation when you brought yourself, your full self, with all your vulnerabilities and flaws to the cross and were met with grace. Pathway, we are to be a church made up of redeemed people who put aside our desires for security and live together in vulnerable, loving community. We are to pursue ministry together, to proclaim the good news together, always trusting in our God. And there will be times when we are alone, when we are separated, when we have to go to work and be the only person who is a Christian, when we go to the missions field and are the only Christians for miles around. We may be left alone by our fellow believers and have to face opposition. Whatever it may be, trust in the Lord. He has delivered you before, and he will deliver you again. Paul has his eyes on the prize. He knows that if he dies, if everything goes wrong, he is going to the heavenly kingdom. The kingdom that Jesus inaugurated in his life, and the kingdom which is going to come in totality at his return. Paul is not just going to be with the king, although he certainly is, but he's going to be with the kingdom. He recognizes that even when he is totally alone, he is a citizen of the heavenly kingdom, an eternal community. Jesus has saved us from our isolation into a never-ending community, made up of every Christian who has ever lived and will ever live. We are never alone. Our King stands with us when all others desert us, and because of that, because we know he is always at our side, we are free to be a part of the community of believers, the church that he has placed us in. For most of us here, if you are a Christian, that community is Pathway. So let me ask you, does this describe your experience with community? Do you feel like you need community? Do you have this loving relationship of vulnerability with other believers based on the gospel? If you do, then don't give it up, especially when it gets rough. We need each other, even though we are probably going to hurt one another. If you have been hurt, forgive. And if you have hurt, go make it right. Look for the people that you can call into community, as Paul is calling Timothy here. Have you been seeing someone every Sunday, wanting to go talk with them and just not, out of maybe a fear of embarrassment or being vulnerable? I want to just clear the air here. If you have been avoiding talking with someone because you asked for their name like a week or a month or 3 months ago, and you've forgotten it, go ask for it again. That's totally fine. Especially if it brings us into closer community. Maybe your answer is no, though. Maybe this is your first Sunday here, and you've come from another church, and you're still wrestling with the pain of what happened there. Maybe you haven't been to church in years, and this is your first Sunday back. Maybe you go to church every Sunday, but you've just never settled at any one church, afraid of what commitment, even for a season, might look like. Maybe you think you've got it all together, that you don't actually need the church to be faithful. Or maybe you've been sitting in these chairs every Sunday, week in and week out, And you hear that same old announcement every week about life groups, about a men's ministry meeting, about a women's ministry meeting, and just never did anything about it. I don't know what's keeping you from community, whether it's genuine pain or a disagreement with our style or anything else. But that is not what we have been saved to. Yes, Jesus is with us when we do not have community, but that is not what he has called us to. Be vulnerable, risk the hurt, take that step in faith, fill out that connect card, talk with that person. Whatever it may be, I promise it will lead to deep, loving relationships, and your ministry impact will increase. Maybe you're sitting here this morning desiring that deep community, but you have questions about this whole Jesus thing. I'm glad you're here. To you, I say this. You are never going to find anyone else who will never let you down. Try trusting him. Try getting to know Jesus. I promise he will not fail you.